Okay, so let's start session one. So I'm a moderator. So my name is Daisuke Kamizu, a professor from Shinshu University and a practice lawyer at Nagashima Tsunematsu in Tokyo. So in session one, so the white collar plan enforcement trend. So we'd like to cover two big topics. So one is voluntary self-disclosure, and another is clawback policy. So both of which mentioned in the remarks provided by Graham and recently. So they are really big topics, and many companies, academics, and practitioners are interested in. And so before digging into the detail, so I'd like to introduce speakers of this session. Professor Jennifer Oren, so is a professor of law at New York University School of Law. She's an internationally recognized expert on corporate crime enforcement, author of more than 45 scholarly publications. She currently is the associate reporter for enforcement for the American Law Institute's Principle of Law on Compliance, Enforcement, and Risk Management for Corporations. And next, Mr. William. And he is Chief Fraud Section, Criminal Division, United States Department of Justice. So he's the chief of the fraud section of that division at the U.S. Department of Justice. In this capacity, so he oversees over 150 federal prosecutors nationwide and supervise these federal criminal investigations and prosecutions involving security fraud, commodities fraud, healthcare fraud, government procurement fraud, federal bribery offenses, and violations of the FCPA. So next is Mr. Dan Karn. So he's a partner of Dave's work. So he's our partner in the white collar crime defense and investigation group. So he previously served for 11 years at the Department of Justice, where he held a number of senior level positions, including the acting deputy assistant attorney general of the criminal division, acting chief of the fraud section, and chief of the FCPA unit. Next to him, so Mr. Matthew Jackis. He's a partner of Eric's Partners. In March last year, so he returned to this company after spending over 3 years as the chief accountant for the enforcement division of the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission. And next to him, so Mr. Brian Benkowski. He's a partner of Carter Morales, and in the regulatory and internal investigations practice group. So he recently returned to their firm after serving for 2 years as a senior confirmed assistant attorney general for DOJ's criminal division. So his 6th senior management position at the Department of Justice. So the question, so why is crucial for investigating authorities such as the DOJ to strongly encourage companies to disclose their wrongdoings voluntarily? So I'd like to ask Professor Jennifer Oren to briefly explain their background and why it's so important for voluntary disclosure.
Thank you very much, Daisuke. I want to thank you for inviting me to join this amazing panel of experts and to have the opportunity to hear the rest of the conference, from which I expect to learn a great deal. So I focus on intentional and knowing misconduct, in particular fraud, such as corruption. And there you have individuals who know they're crossing the line, they know they're violating the law, and who are benefiting from it. And the focus of my work is on the fact that you need to intervene with the individuals to get them to not want to do the crime. Now, we have 2 ways of doing that. One is the the incentive effects, I'm an economist, the threat of going to jail or criminal sanctions. But the other is people do want to be able to tell themselves they're decent people. In fact, many corporate criminals have tried to keep telling themselves they're decent people, and they want other people to think they are. So the law can use what we refer to as expressive mechanisms, norms, to get people to change. Now, this does relate back to self-reporting, because the main source of norms in employees' lives is not the law's prohibition on corruption. It's the norms that the corporations set forth for them, right? And it's not the norm from the CEO, it's the lived norm on the ground, right? What are you rewarded for? What are your fellow employees doing and getting away with it, not being punished for? What gets you ahead in your firm? Those kind of norms. So, in order to pull both of those levers, you really need federal prosecutors to be able to catch the crime and punish it. And you need them to be able to do it with a high probability. And the reason for that is people discount low probability events. If you're 1 in 1,000 likely to get caught, it's not the case that you look at the benefit of misconduct and you go, all right, it's 1 in 1,000 that I might go to jail. No, you look at the benefit of misconduct and that 1 in 1,000 vanishes. People ignore things that are almost never likely to happen. And Eugene Soltis has a good book, Why They Do It, and he talked to a lot of white-collar criminals about why they did it. And they weren't weighing the costs. It wasn't salient, because they knew they were very, very unlikely to get caught. The biggest issue in deterring white-collar crime is, the way I look at it, is there's this huge iceberg of white-collar crime. The detected misconduct is not the tip of the iceberg, it's the iceberg, ice cube on top of the iceberg. It's tiny, notwithstanding amazing efforts on everyone's part. We need to change that. We need a corporate criminal to think, if I do this, I'd be happy for a 5% chance I'll get caught. And therefore, we need to pull the most effective levers. That's the corporation. The corporation is best positioned to detect and to investigate, and we need to incentivize them to do that. Notice that detection and self-reporting has another effect. It changes internal norms. You say to employees, your corporation cares so much that you follow the norm that they're going to catch you because they don't like what you're doing. They're going to turn you in, turn themselves in, and turn in evidence against you. The government's going to punish you, and so is the firm. That changes the norm in the firm, and people will see people being punished. So that's why self-reporting, you can't get anywhere without corporate self-reporting unless you can get really, really effective individual whistleblowing. But we're not there yet.
Thank you, Jane. So Brian, would you like to supplement from?
Look, I agree with. Yeah, I agree with the framework that Jennifer set forward here. I mean, voluntary self-disclosure is important because it's what responsible corporate actors, as a general matter, should do. From the department's perspective, and those of us on the panel who've been at the department or are at the department know, DOJ is an organization of very limited resources. So Jennifer's discussion about the 1% versus increasing the percentage. On the department's end, they just don't have the ability to go out and ferret out corporate crime. It's a priority, it's always a priority, but you could have a limitless number of agents and prosecutors and investigators dedicated to corporate crime, and you still would, you wouldn't move much of the needle in terms of the iceberg that Jennifer's talked about. And so the department is at it's on the one end, when corporate crime is discovered, it is disclosed, the department holds sort of all the cards in dealing with companies. But in the other direction, the department is at such a disadvantage in terms of information flow and investigatory resources that they need companies to be able to do this. And I think the department's gone a long way, and we're going to talk about this, I think, in a good bit of detail, in trying to figure out in the last decade ways to incentivize corporations, the carrots and the sticks to get them to come forward. I think every administration for the last 2 or 3 has thought about this aggressively, has moved the needle in terms of the incentive structure and refining it in a way that hopefully is increasing the kind of disclosure that we need here to prohibit corporate crime and to hold individuals accountable. So I'll stop there, Daisuke, but I think Jennifer's set the stage, quite well in terms of, what we talk about next and where we go from here.
Thank you, Brian. So, since the Monaco memo, which we discussed last year, so the memo was issued in September last year, and since then, so we have seen several voluntary disclosure policies issued by several offices and divisions. So would you like to briefly explain the development about these policies?
Sure, very, very happy to. And so just sort of picking up on what Brian was saying, you have the Department of Justice coming out with a number of policies that are, number one, geared at, as Glenn forecasted in his speech, geared at transparency, trying to tell companies what they can expect from the department, but as you've now been hearing, why, incentivizing companies to come in. A lot of these crimes are very difficult to detect. On top of the resources issue, a lot of the evidence often resides overseas in foreign countries. It's difficult to obtain, and so getting a company to come in, to cooperate, to share that evidence is critical for the department to be able to make these cases. And so with that in mind, really starting in 2016 through today, there have been iterations of voluntary disclosure policies. And most recently, there were updates to the criminal division, which is what Brian headed when he was my boss, and where Glenn is sort of leading the foremost section prosecuting these types of crimes. They came out with a very, I will say, probably the most company-friendly voluntary disclosure program and policy. The other U.S. attorneys' offices and other components have come out with other policies as well. The difference is the policies that were announced by the U.S. attorneys' offices and other components, if you voluntarily self-disclose, fully cooperate, and fully remediate, there is a presumption that you won't get a guilty plea. Whereas if you disclose to the fraud section, for example, or other components or other sections in the criminal division, there is a presumption that you will get a declination, meaning that the department will walk away entirely as long as you disgorge the ill-gotten gain. So that's a significant difference. And so the question is it enough to encourage those companies that Brian and Jennifer were talking about to get them to not be submerged with the iceberg, but come up to the ice cube and present it to the DOJ? And I truly think that is going to come down to how it plays out in practice, because there are so many necessarily aspects of the voluntary disclosure program, including even the more favorable one out of the criminal division, that says if you have aggravating circumstances, so if there were high-level executives involved, if it was particularly pervasive misconduct, in order to get that presumption of a declination, you need to disclose it immediately, which I think Glenn and others have been very helpful in saying that doesn't mean within a matter of minutes, it means weeks, maybe even months. You have to engage in extraordinary cooperation. That's a very high standard. And you need to have had an effective compliance program at the time of the misconduct. Now, that's a very admirable thing to want to try and encourage companies to do, but I think the question for companies and the question for DOJ is, how are you going to actually interpret this moving forward, because if you think about the types of cases that you want to incentivize as DOJ, those are the ones that you want the most, the aggravating circumstances cases, right? You want the cases where the CEO was involved in misconduct. You want the company to walk it in so you can prosecute that CEO. And if you're going to hold companies to a very, very high standard and say, sorry, your compliance program at the time just wasn't up to snuff, you're gonna lose those voluntary disclosures. And so I think what you're gonna see is how is this going to play out in practice? And I think credit to the fraud section with a very recent resolution in a different context with the clawback pilot program, which I know we're going to talk about shortly, but they actually went beyond the letter of the policy and gave the company credit despite the fact that it was not just a clawback, but it was refusing to pay bonuses moving forward, which I know we'll talk about. But point is, if the department shows that they're willing to give declinations, even when the company may not be hitting all of the very high standards that have been laid out, you're going to start to see a lot more disclosures.
So, Jennifer, would you like to supplement?
How did you know? But I don't want to take time away from. I just wanted to drop a footnote that the ALI principles on corporate enforcement, for the reasons Dan pointed out, which is, what are the crimes you really want to get self-reported? Really, really big ones. Crimes with senior managers involved, crimes that have gone on for a long time. They allow for declinations or, at the most, NPAs in cases where you've self-reported, fully cooperated in the DOJ sense by turning over individuals and fully remediated. Part of how I did that without feeling I was a corporate apologist, because I don't want to be, was to say we do some extra looking at whether you really, really remediated your current compliance program, and remediation includes looking at the individuals in your firm responsible for the misconduct and responsible for looking the other way, because I'm really, really devoted to getting the supervisors who knew full well it was happening and either condoned or encouraged it. If the company can show they're really cleaning house on the individuals who were in charge and they're fully cooperating, there's good reasons for a declination or NPA, especially with big misconduct, because you want to be able to get it fast, stop it, remediate it. So that is an issue, and the fact that the U.S. Attorney's offices only did guilty plea and not declination, I was sad. That was a missed opportunity to create genuine incentives.
And the department never wants to make Jennifer sad. So it's
I don't know, you know, some days yes, some days no. You know.
So one question I have is that when discussing corporate voluntary disclosure, so you usually explain voluntary disclosure and through cooperation and through remediation. But I understand that there is one more condition, which is a disclosure. And some Japanese companies usually forget. So that aspect, or do not know that. So and I'd like to ask Jennifer, why disgorgement is important? To give her.
I put disgorgement under remediation, as does the fraud section, and that's because as long as you let sort of straightforward incentives, as long as companies profit from crime, they will not be fully motivated to have compliance programs designed to prevent it. And maybe if they can't help themselves, they might turn someone in for doing it if they're afraid they'll get caught. But they're not going to change their systems that will reward salesmen for how many sales they do, even if we're going, ooh, I don't know how you could possibly be so successful without bribing. Or pharmaceutical representatives who are selling more opioids in Arkansas than is the population of Arkansas, or that kind of thing. So you need the company to think, crime costs me. And as long as countries let companies keep the profit of crime, countries are enabling corporate crime.
So, Greg, do you want to supplement?
Oh boy, a couple of thoughts. This is a great way to kick this off. The department, we're here to prosecute. We don't make policy. My job is not to make policy. The criminal division, the fraud section of my team is not here to make policy. Having said that, we issue a lot of guidance and some people call policies as well. So we are trying to strike that balance. Our job is to communicate with the corporate community through our resolutions and through the cases we choose to bring and how we resolve them. Having said that, just taking 2 steps back, I mean, where we were, we, the corporate community, we the Department of Justice 10 years ago, most companies, and I think I saw a stat somewhere that most companies 10 years ago, 12 years ago, say 10 years ago, did not have a compliance program, did not have these types of conversations. We weren't having these types of, these policies didn't exist, and I think now, by any measure, if you look at where the corporate community was 10 years ago to where they are today, it's been a significant improvement. More compliance, more discussions, and more compliance programs. I forget the exact stat, but I think maybe 10 or 15% of all companies had a compliance program at all 10 years ago. Now, majority, maybe the vast majority do. I think that's credit to Brian, Dan, and my predecessors in the department writ large, and I think that's just worth acknowledging. There's more to do, and I think the resolutions we bring and the policies we tweak and the carrots and sticks we try to create more of a separation. We'll get there further. I talked about the 3 through lines during my speech. I think I mentioned these policies are intended to give greater transparency, improve compliance, and just having encourage companies to have an effective compliance program and encouraging cooperation. If there was really one through line, it's encouraging companies to have effective compliance programs, because if you have that, whether or not the department actually finds that person in the ice cube, the companies will have less misconduct. They will detect it earlier. They will have less. They will handle it. Whether or not they disclose it to us, there will just be less bad things will happen. Bad things are always going to happen. Crimes are always going to be committed. There's always going to be misconduct at companies, but there will be less of it, and that's what we want. The Department of Justice is always going to be a business, but I think that is just something worth recognizing, and just kind of taking 2 steps back. Now we're here to fine tune and figure out how can we get companies to come forward more than they already are. And I think Brian, Dan, and Jennifer have really hit on some of that. I'll throw one other out, and I know I think there's another panel that's going to talk about this. We talk about data analytics, but I think that is another opportunity for the department. If we can, to Brian's point, limited resources, there are only so many cases we can detect, there are only so many cases we're going to find on our own. However, data analytics is a powerful tool. We are doing more and more exciting and important work there. And if we can signal to the corporate community that we, the department, are going to look at publicly available information and find an FCPA violation on our own without anyone walking it in, that can be very significant. So I'm not making any proclamations, I'm not trying to make any news by any stretch, but I do think, we've been public that is the direction we're heading, and I think that is something we're going to continue to do. Improving our policies, absolutely we're going to continue to do that. We've had some resolutions, we're going to have a number more in the next several weeks that are going to become public, and we're going to get more information about. There are going to be other companies that will get more than that 25%, that they're going to be in that 25 to 50%. That will be information to the corporate community, the kinds of incentives we're going to give. We are going to have a couple of CEP declarations with disgorgement, a couple more to come this year. I think that will be more information to the corporate community as well. Just some initial thoughts.
I just wanted to add one sort of plug for one of Glenn's 3 throughputs or through points, and that's transparency. I think when you have clear rules, clear expectations, a common, what we used to call it, the common law of resolutions that was being developed across the corporate space, when you have like cases treated in like ways, and you disclose to the public and to the corporate community the things that the company did to get the resolution that they got, the positive, the negative, as that body grows, and that transparency sort of takes hold and takes root, it leads to consistency, and consistency motivates corporations to come forward and disclose when they can look at the body of work and say, we look a lot like that company, and that's the resolution that they got, and we're comfortable with that. It increases the likelihood that companies are going to come forward because there's predictability and some level of certainty about what the back end is going to look like. And we can talk about the challenges of voluntary self-disclosure, but the big one is it's a really hard decision for companies when you can't give them clear guidance about what the back end is going to look like for them, for management, for shareholders, and for their reputation in the public.
Okay, so there maybe the DOJ's guidance, so guidance about the voluntary disclosure policy in the SEC as well. And so would you like to explain the voluntary disclosure policy in the SEC?
Thanks, Daisuke, and thanks for having us here today. It's a wonderful conference, and thank you for the brochure. It's the first brochure I could show my kids. I could actually go to school with my kids. So it's very popular in us. And Glenn, you mentioned data analytics a couple times. You're really stacking it up on Matt Galvin for his panel later today. A lot of pressure on there. I can't wait to see what Minority Report, like system he's built for the future. Look, the Securities and Exchange Commission, it's interesting to me because a lot of the folks on the panel here do work in both spaces, SEC, DOJ, and others. But their cooperation programs are different. One of the most notable is the DOJ has, and Glenn, you mentioned it today, percentages of discounts you're going to get on penalties, where the SEC has explicitly said we're not going to have rigid metrics. Instead, they go to the seaboard factors for cooperation, and those are self-policing, self-reporting, remediation, and cooperation. And the question becomes, okay, what do those things mean? Jennifer, I hear you talk about remediation, and you went right to firing people. Well, that's a big one for the SEC. That is a big one, but there's a lot of other things in there too. And when you think about the SEC as a civil agency, and for those who don't know, it's comprised of 5 presidentially appointed commissioners, and typically it's 3 of one party weighting towards whoever's in the White House. It's different. It's different than DOJ, and the civil tends to play in the gray a little, dealing with cases, and particularly when I was there as the chief accountant of the enforcement division, dealing with cases in the gray, maybe, not beyond reasonable doubt, sort of preponderance of evidence. And so cooperation, remediation, it's not always corruption, people you have to go and fire. Sometimes it's sophisticated accounting judgments that the government may see different than the company. And so what does cooperation mean if it doesn't mean firing a whole sales group? It means maybe remediating, putting in new policies and procedures. And so I like what Brian said, the transparency. Because when you hear those 4 things and you ask, well, what does that mean? And you hear commissioners speak, obviously with a little bit of a political bent behind it, and they say things like, well, cooperation, it doesn't mean complying with a subpoena. You're obligated to do that, but that's going beyond. But you have to look to the orders, the actual actions brought by the commission to figure out what that means. And some of the themes you can pull out of there are companies that went out and took things very seriously, maybe appointed a special committee or retained outside counsel and experts, voluntarily shared results of the investigation. Didn't violate privilege, but necessarily, but went close to there, pushing the limits of what they could share. And then shared relevant documents, maybe with some targeted so that the government didn't have to come through it. The theme is, to me, is always, and having sat in that seat, is did you make the government's job easier? Did you take time away from what they would spend doing, sort of the resources point that Glenn makes? And I think those are really critical to think about. The SEC, they go through sort of ebbs and flows of how much they put in those orders, or the settled orders, or typically settled orders, as to how much of a description they put. They're trying now, they say, and I'm seeing it, to be more descriptive. Oh, these people translated documents for us. They went above and beyond. And I think that's important because that consistency that Brian talked about is really the key. It's easy in a vacuum to look at one company and say they did this wrong or right, but companies want to look across the spectrum, look across their industry. When you're in the boardroom talking to somebody about why you want to voluntarily disclose and what that means, it's much easier to say, hey, here's what 3 companies did in a similar situation, and here's what they got credit for. That's a much easier conversation than, well, I work there and I feel like this might help us. And so I think, sort of thinking of the 2, DOJ and SEC, we're close, and I think Gary Gensler, who's the chairman of the SEC now, when the Monaco memo came out, said, they're broadly consistent. But there's also a lot of differences. And the real magic happens when you've got a matter that the DOJ and SEC are interested in. And how do you thread that cooperation needle so that you make sure everybody's getting what they want?
Just to add one point, and I'm curious if Matt agrees with this, because obviously he's the SEC expert, but when I've looked at SEC resolutions, comparing companies that have voluntarily self-disclosed, cooperated, or remediated versus companies that haven't voluntarily self-disclosed but have fully cooperated and fully remediated, it's very difficult to see the difference in how they're treated. Oftentimes, you may end up with a voluntary disclosure case where there's still a resolution, there's disgorgement, there's no penalty, or maybe there's a smaller penalty, but then you look at companies that haven't voluntarily self-disclosed but have cooperated or remediated, and it's the same thing. And I think the result of that has cascading effects both for the SEC but also for DOJ, because when a company is thinking about, do we voluntarily self-disclose to DOJ, they're thinking, okay, well, what does that mean? Does it mean we're going to have, even if we end up with this presumption of a declination because of the transparency that everyone's talking about, we're still going to have a 3+ year investigation. It's going to cost, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, oftentimes millions. And the SEC is still going to have a resolution, no matter what we do. And so are we better off waiting and seeing what happens? And if SEC or DOJ comes knocking, we just, we cooperate, we remediate, and we hope for the best with DOJ, but at least there's a really good chance no one's ever going to find out about this, which, of course, Matt Galvin and Glenn and others are working on to try to prevent, but still, there's no way that they were going to catch the iceberg, right? Like maybe they increase it from an ice cube to an ice tray, but there's just no way that they have the resources, the ability to do it. And so is it more important to try to incentivize companies to want to bring this in? And because they know that if they're doing their best to catch this misconduct, to cooperate with DOJ, and then to remediate it when they catch it, and to fix it so that it doesn't happen again, they'll get a pass and DOJ will go after the individuals because, as the Deputy Attorney General keeps saying, individual accountability is the best way to achieve deterrence.
Okay. So Dan, do your first. I think you're right. I think the consistency isn't there. It depends on the administration. One thing, if you were to do that same study, you put out there review, and you controlled for which office at the SEC, which team, I bet you'd start to see a little more consistency. But one thing, I think that the Securities and Exchange Commission, they struggle with public companies is you have varying sizes, the degree of the conduct, things like that. But you're absolutely right. And I think driving more towards that consistency that Brian's mentioned and others is the key. Because again, you want to go to your client and say, here's the examples. And if they look at the examples and say, what does this mean? And you say, well, if you trace this here and this, we might get this. It's really complicated. It really is.
Okay, so Dan already speak about the reality. So and we next we'll go to the reality point of view. So so we just I just so make a reference about to the some Monaco remarks on October 4th, and I think so she explained several examples, and I'd like to ask the Brent about the recent trend. So so what is the trend? So we can see regarding the voluntary disclosure in reality. So in the real cases, and the number of voluntary disclosure cases increased in the criminal division, for example, 3 or 4 years, 5 years, and is it as expected?
So when I was before I came back to DOJ, I was in-house at doing leading a compliance team at a company, and we had a rule, we had an expression, the rule of small numbers, that we would always look and try to measure for trends, but then we would realize this is a small snapshot that we can't really say, we're not going to proclaim we've made a big difference or there's a big problem based on a small sample. That's sort of my answer right here. So I just as a matter of just candor and transparency, before I would come out and say we have doubled or tripled, we need a bigger sample is the quite honest, frank answer. Having said that, we are measuring, and I can say that my team in particular is going back not just in the FCPA context, but although that is the biggest area where we have self-disclosures, but not the only area. We are measuring that as we speak. We've gone back and so our look back is going a couple of years through and including the present. So at this time, I don't want to say, it's gone up by X percent, or I don't want to say that because I just think I can. I can tell you anecdotally, it does feel like it's trending in that direction. But I like, one of the themes that's emerging here is data and numbers and metrics. I want to be able, before I can say that, I want to make sure I have enough of a sample. But I will say, as the DAG indicated, we had a major CEP declination earlier this year. I can also say, again, without making any news, we're going to have 2 more announced before the end of the year, and that'll be more information. So that is, I think last year we had 2, so this year we'll have more than 2, I anticipate. I will say just another general point, this is something that is not a CEP declination, but just worth noting, and this is true of any prosecutor's office, whether it's my office, whether it's a U.S. Attorney's office, prosecutors all over the country, and SEC as well for that matter, decline cases all the time, and they're just not public. In other words, the job of a prosecutor is to choose to use your time and resources to bring in the right cases. So we have all sorts of cases that we just decline quietly and privately, not as a CEP declination, just as a case we've investigated and realized because there's insufficient evidence, it's stale evidence, there may be other appropriate ways to deal with misconduct. That is routine that's done in every prosecutor's office around the country. That is not in the CEP context, and that's probably not what we're talking about, but it at least bears noting that the part of a good prosecutor and a good prosecutor's office is to use judgment every day to figure out which cases to bring or not. But in this context, the CEP declination, the honest answer, give a long answer for a short, really short answer. I think anecdotally it feels like we're heading in that right direction, but I can't say exactly what the metrics say just now.
Thank you very much. And so I think, so in order to address the corporate crime, so I think we need to tackle or overcome some information asymmetry. So and in order to fill that gap, so one is encouraging companies to voluntarily disclose the case, but another tool is whistleblowing. So so Jennifer, would you like to raise this point? So what's the perspective?
Well, I think there are many challenges to our self-reporting. One was touched on by my co-panelists, which is it's difficult to get companies to self-report if they're not 100% sure what they're going to get. And if it's not, and as Dan pointed out, there's not a big enough wedge between what you get if you self-report, cooperate, and remediate, which includes disgorgement, versus just cooperate and remediate. And a huge problem is there's not a big enough wedge. Or if you have uncertainty, because of the SEC, I'll toss in the CFTC, although they're actually better than the SEC on this. And then foreign enforcement, so that's a big issue. But the other problem is, I talked to many defense lawyers who say, well, if I've got a big company with a more long-standing crime, and particularly a big crime, and I don't really think I have a whistleblower, then it's best for us to just remediate, like let's get rid of it, and then investigate, fix our root causes, and then pray. And we're very likely to do just fine. So I've been thinking more and more about how to make companies uncomfortable in that calculus, and whistleblowers are the key. It's one of the keys. And the SEC whistleblower policy was a great first step. It's not going to fix the problem because it's a great idea. But if you're getting 20 or 25 cases, I forget where they are now, in a 10-year period, that's not going to be scaring companies.
Those numbers are way off.
All right.
They paid out over $1 billion. I don't know the SEC, the whistleblower.
Not the magnitude, the number of cases.
Yeah, I think it's even higher. I think it's more than 20.
Even if it's 30.
I think it's, we'll get those up.
All right, but individual, not numbers of whistleblowers, numbers of companies. Because many companies have multiple whistleblowers.
That resolving, that lead to resolutions.
Right.
Because there's obviously like
Many companies,
thousands and thousands of reports.
so I've been trying to get numbers of companies from the SEC and I just can't. And a number of the whistleblowers were out of the same corporate facts, and I just have no idea how to handle that when I look at the number of whistleblowers. And even if I get it to 100 whistleblowers, it's just not, it's certainly not 100 a year, 1,000 a year, it's not.
Yeah, so can I just jump in on this? So I think a couple of things, and this goes to what Dan said, or what Glenn said about declining cases, which is, so I think the SEC had averages about 10,000 whistleblowers a year that come in, and those all get a lot of attention. They also average, when I was there, it was 20,000 TCRs, that's tips, complaints, and referrals. So anything that comes on the website that's not qualified as a whistleblower. During the pandemic and the meme stock craze, that TCR number went to 60,000. People were in their basements, they had a lot of time on their hands, they were angry about whatever their trades on Robinhood. And so all those get attention too. So you're talking about the end, which I understand, you know, a smaller number that the public sees. Obviously, you know, it's had a great effect if you just look at the dollars paid out and the impact in that regard. What we're not seeing is a lot of those cases get a lot of attention. Now look, some of those complaints come in and they're mad because they got a bad lease from General Motors and they want to sue the SEC to investigate General Motors. There's a lot of garbage in that, right? But you have to give each one the proper due. You have to find the signal and the noise. But a lot of those lead to inquiries or investigations where you might not bring a case, but a company has to look hard, they have to maybe remediate, they have to think about things. So I think the program has had more of the desired effect you're talking about, but probably not what you can see and study.
So you're exactly right, it's had more effect than I'm talking about. Particularly since I'm focused on intentional misconduct, so I care a lot if the individual wrongdoer is just fine.
If you're up that standard base 10B fraud, like that's a different standard.
And the FCPA. And I'm focusing on the number of corporate resolutions that had a whistleblower, because that's what, if you're talking to the board of directors or the general counsel, should we report, what's the odds of a whistleblower, that's the number that tells you that. I think the SEC is doing an amazing job with the resources it has. I just think about how would you move the needle more. And, you know, it may be worth exploring, and this is something I've started exploring as of 2 o'clock yesterday. So it's a new idea, which means there's a high probability it's a terrible idea. So I'm going to share it in public with as many people as possible. But I do that because I really love having people tell me why I'm wrong, because then I'll be better. So I think there's some basis, particularly with group misconduct or misconduct that's likely to be industry-wide, to start announcing the equivalent of an individual declination policy. If you come in group misconduct, for misconduct you're doing that you have really good reason to think other people are doing, we will give you either the individual equivalent of an NPA or a declination. We will change the clawback policy to say it doesn't apply to anyone who was the first to self-report. So if you self-report, you don't get a clawback. And start scaring firms that the individuals in them who were lower level, I don't want to make it the kingpin, but the lower level guys, start getting them to be more willing to come in the door. That might help move the needle in getting corporations to think there's more different ways the information could come into the DOJ. Because sometimes I talk, not a lot of white-collar criminals, but I have a couple I talk to, who got in over, you know, a little bit over and over their head, and by the time they woke up and admitted to themselves what they were doing, which they've been lying to themselves about obvious misconduct, they were looking at serious jail time, but actually wanted out desperately. And if there was a way to say to them, you know, if you're the kingpin, that's not true, you know, but if you would be bringing us a massive crime and you're not the top of the needle, we're actually going to promise you you're okay if you're in first. Maybe that would help supplement the SEC whistleblower program. But again, this idea is less than 24 hours. Been thinking about it for less than 24 hours, so I don't yet know all the reasons this is a terrible idea, and I'm sure my colleagues.
Yeah, I think it's senior convenience programs for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so one more topic, so we need to cover, and
Yeah.
so it's a very one of the big development recently. So I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, so Monaco announced a new policy regarding the property disclosure on M&A. So, Graham, so would you like to explain the background and so briefly overview this guidance?
Sure. I will do it at a high level, although and not to punt on the question, but I'll tee it up. I'm very interested in the feedback, because I know there's been a lot of, it's just come out, and I know that Dan, Brian, everyone, a lot of people have given it thought, and I'm just kind of curious the feedback and maybe have that discussion. But and I touched on this in the opening remarks. This is at a high level the Deputy Attorney General announced, as indicated. I think it's up there. For companies that acquire another company, if you disclose misconduct of the acquired company within 6 months after the closing of that acquisition, that company, the acquiring company, is entitled to a presumption of a declination, especially including if that company then fully remediates within a year following. So it's styled as a safe harbor policy, but it is a further intentional effort by the Deputy Attorney General to create a safe harbor, a safe place for acquiring companies to disclose misconduct of acquired companies. That's at a very high level. The Deputy Attorney General also, though, did direct each of the components of the department, including the criminal division, U.S. Attorney's offices, all other parts of the department, to adapt, because they may have their own M&A policies, they may have their own self-disclosure policies. So this is an umbrella, and encourage each component to adapt as they see fit. The other part of it is that there is, and I'm paraphrasing here, so I'm not trying to create new policy, I'm just telling you my understanding of what DAG came out with, is that there's a reasonableness presumption. So we acknowledge, and as I said in opening remarks, every situation is different, every case is different, and certainly, speaking for my team, we are going to take every case on their own. Part of our corporate enforcement policy, we do have a part of that it does address the M&A context, and I see the DAG's policy, the safe harbor policy, not trumping, but supplementing and working side by side with it. So those are some high themes. I understand the devil's in the details. I understand there may be scenarios that are concerning to folks. I'd be interested to hear that and talk it through. But again, at a very high level, it's acknowledging the realities. It's trying to incentivize, if you just take 2 steps away from it, a company that has a good, strong compliance culture and compliance program, incentivizing them to acquire companies that may not, for the greater good. So I think the intention is certainly, as a policy, very well intended, understanding that the devil may be a bit in the details as we start applying it. But not to take over your questioning, but I'm curious what the other panelists have to say.
And I'm happy to kick it off. I'm sure Dan and Matt have experienced some of this. One, I think, as a general matter, heartened by the announcement. I think it's a continuation. If you go back and look at the evaluation of corporate compliance programs document that we did those many years ago, there's a section in there specifically about M&A, where we did want to start the discussion with companies through the prism of how we would review their compliance programs, how they deal with M&A. I think in the real world, there's more than one type of M&A, and I think the incentive structures are different across the various types of M&A. Public companies that acquire new companies are much more incentivized to spend the money and take the time, both on the front end in diligence and on the back end in integration, to find problems and to remediate them and disclose them, because their incentive structure is to pull this new asset, this new company, under the umbrella, integrate them into the corporate structure, into the corporate
into the compliance regime, the compliance culture of that company. Private equity M&A is vastly different. When you have private equity funds, their job is to go out and they perform a valuable function. They go out and they find companies, oftentimes they're founder-led, family-started companies that are doing okay, but there's a lot of value that can be unlocked in those companies if they're taken to the next level. And in that context, private equity's job, and look, they're very numbers-driven, very analytical about the bottom line, is acquire, improve, sell along a continuum of probably 3 to 5 years. And it's not in their nature as business folks and as numbers crunchers to find problems and solve problems, because that doesn't unlock value, it impedes value. That doesn't shorten the timeline to sale and profitability, it increases the timeline to sale and it reduces the path to profitability. And so I think one of the challenges the department's going to face is differentiating between how they treat one type of M&A and the disclosures associated with it versus others. I think that 6 months is, and I think everyone would say they're heartened by the sort of reasonableness standard. 6 months is really short. And a year to get it done is pretty short, depending upon the size of the acquisition, the complexities associated with it. But I know the department has said they're not setting hard and fast rules, and that's helpful. But again, it's like we're all going to be watching carefully. And I think that for folks like Dan and me, the conversations with our clients are going to be different about self-disclosure depending upon the various 2 types of contexts that you face.
Yeah, and wholeheartedly agree with everything Brian's saying. And I'll say again, credit to Brian and Matt Miner with Brian when they were there coming out with an M&A component to the corporate enforcement policy, which Glenn has obviously been overseeing as well. Look, the part that I find interesting about this guidance, and we always say transparency is good, and it is, but the more and more transparent you are, the more you risk putting out something that is actually harsher than what was happening in practice. And ironically, you have the SEC not putting out anything, even though they're the regulator, and then you have the enforcement authority, the prosecutor putting out guidance, kind of like they are the regulator. And so there is this M&A guidance out there. I think historically, most people would have assumed if you're acquiring a company, you clean it up, you find something, you disclose it, DOJ is not going to prosecute that, right? Because you're taking what DOJ has said, you're finding a company that's bad or not as good, you're cleaning it up, we want to reward that. What the new guidance and what the DAG announced is, yes, the acquiring company gets the benefit of this, but there's still this delta between how the acquiring company is treated versus how the target company is treated. And so what has been said is there's a presumption of a declination in a way that is even more favorable than the existing voluntary disclosure policy that's out there, because aggravating circumstances don't apply, it won't count against you for purposes of recidivism. But then the target company, you may get a declination, but it's only a potential declination, and only if not aggravating circumstances. And so there's this huge carve out for the target company, but if you think about it, the target company is part of the acquiring company. And so in that way, the M&A due diligence policy is actually more restrictive than the existing voluntary disclosure policy, because under the existing voluntary disclosure policy, parent company finds something at its subsidiary, walks it in, DOJ is not going to prosecute the subsidiary but give a declination to the parent. It's all part of the same company. And so I think, again, it will be important to see how this plays out in practice, and if DOJ is going to treat the target company, which is essentially a subsidiary of the parent company, like the parent company and give them the benefit of the declination too. And I have confidence in the reasonableness of people like Glenn and others who will want to incentivize that and recognize that aspect of it.
So I thought it's a great policy announcement. I did notice what Dan said and think that as long as the parent company thinks it has to worry about its target, that's a problem. What I think is particularly helpful about it is a big red flag out there, particularly for founders who sometimes are tempted to sail across the wind, violate the law. And this is a signal to them that if they think they want to grow their firm and get acquired by being criminals, this makes this riskier if they're going to be selling to a publicly held firm who's going to investigate and then turn them in. And I'm hoping the way this will play out is that there will be a lot of follow-on individual prosecutions of individuals, particularly founders, that did these crimes. And if that happens, that could be very exciting.
There's a very common, I think Jennifer's right when it comes to public companies acquiring founder-led companies. In the private equity context, though, what happens is new management is sent in by private equity, right? So private equity sits up here, they fund the acquisition, new CEO, new CFO, new chief operating officer. The A team gets brought in to take the company to the next level. And their incentive is almost aligned in many respects with the founders, which is they just want to get to the point where they're profitable and sell. And so it's the incentives. I'm not saying that that's, and I'm not suggesting that that's, people will turning a blind eye to corporate misconduct when they come in and manage companies, but they're focused on improving the company's profitability play and position. And anything that detracts from that in their 3-year window, the incentive structure for wanting to go tackle that problem, there's not the same alignment. And so, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it's just a difference in the way these deals are done and the way that the companies are managed post-acquisition. I think that private equity and the managers that take over these companies, I've had at least a half dozen of these conversations in private practice. You get the butt-kicking CEO who's brought in to take this family-run company and turn it into a profitable business, and you tell them they've got this problem and they need to think about going to the government and disclosing it and solving it. And all they want to know is how long is that going to take? What's it going to cost me? And are we going to end up in a situation where we're not going to be able to sell the company? So part of this is going to be cultural and having to change mindsets. But it's also just a very practical reality of, the types of disclosures the department can probably expect in the immediate aftermath of this policy, and how they react to those disclosures is going to be really important in terms of advancing the sort of cultural change in those kinds of transactions.
Brian, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Which is, do you think the DOJ could move the needle on those acquisitions, which you really have inspired me to think about more, by modifying the clawback policy to say we're going to give rewards to parent companies that in the acquisition reserve some of the compensation, some of the bonuses that go to executives, because there are a lot of change of, provisions in that, and reserve some of the payout for 6 months until they've seen if there's misconduct?
Yeah, those financial incentives often are the most powerful. How you and where you kind of apply that pressure, right? The founder who sells his company, his family business, to private equity and stays on the board for a year, right? Those families don't want to hear, we'll give you half now and we'll give you half in a year when we figure out whether we bought a clean company or a not so clean company. But that's one way to do it, right? Is that would incentivize founder-led companies to have their house in order pre-sale and the purchasers to get their house in order post-sale. but my only point is right now, it's more complicated than I think folks may be thinking about and contemplating. Because a lot of the misconduct that DOJ should care about, we talk about big companies with big problems, but a lot of the corporate crime that occurs in these kinds of companies. The number of times you go in and you look, and you just look slightly under the hood, and the things that you find, you realize sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's just this company got too big too fast, and the family didn't know how to run it, and they ended up upside down from a regulatory standpoint or a legal standpoint. Now, how do you fix it without impeding value going forward is going to be a challenge.
The one thing I throw out there on this, I always like to think about unintended consequences, is we do a lot of work with post-purchase price disputes, right? And not that this would be used often, but you can imagine, and we've seen that particularly with family-run companies where these things go nuclear.
Yeah. Should we sue the family?
Is somebody going to roll this in as a weapon in that litigation to say, okay, we just reported you to the DOJ, and you know, we're going to be fine. I mean, that'll be an interesting thing. How you all police against that will be really important, because that could be a very I don't know how to say this, but like you don't want that out there, and you don't want that out there. It's a threat out there. Maybe something you're not going to have transparency into.
Okay, so we have just 10 minutes to discuss global policy.
Plenty of time.
So actually, so I think almost so everyone know that. So this global policy, initially employed by the WCC and then now so the DOJ so announced last year so to employ the global policy and in this March so the new guidance and the new policy was issued. And I think so. We have just 10 minutes, so I'd like to hear your feedback. So about the global policy. So Dan.
Sure. So look, the clawback pilot program and policy. I think again, I don't think it's a negative thing. I think the only negative thing you can say about it, to the extent there's a net negative, is the focus on clawbacks as opposed to other parts of the compliance program. I just personally think that there are other parts of the compliance program that are more important, and by elevating clawbacks to have its own policy to focus on it in this way, I think may detract and may focus compliance resources away from things that just may be more important. That said, putting aside that potential negative, I think the other question is just how effective this will be. And I think around the margins, and particularly the way that Glenn and the fraud section have applied it, at least in the first instance, is really heartening and good to see that they're giving companies benefits for refusing to pay bonuses as opposed to clawing them back. I just personally think that clawbacks are not the most effective way to deter or punish misconduct, except in very limited circumstances. And we can all sit here and come up with examples of the CEO that was going to get $100 million and that is going to get clawed back, and so maybe that deters him. But for most people, there's not that much money to claw back. And most people who actually engage in misconduct, the question is, are they truly going to say, I am going to engage in this misconduct, I may get fired, I may go to jail, but I'm still going to do it. Oh wait, you're going to claw back some money from me? That's more important to me than going to jail or getting fired, so now I'm not going to engage in the misconduct. And I just think that the number of people that feel that way, it's going to be a very small percentage. And so I just don't think it's as effective a tool, and so I don't know that it's worth elevating it, but at the same time, it certainly doesn't seem objectionable to me. I think compensation as part of compliance is a broader conversation, and credit to Glenn and Matt and the fraud section and the criminal division for putting it in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs as a broader item to consider, and I think that's really where the conversation should be.
I just really quickly, I was also heartened by what I heard from Glenn today about Alamo. If you're gonna claw back $750,000 worth of bonuses from somebody who's already had the bonus paid, you're gonna incur, just the cost benefit on that for a company is way misaligned. It costs you nothing, probably, to withhold a bonus in the future. It's a much easier thing for a company to do, and the impact should on the individual be the same. So I think that as this policy evolves, there may be circumstances where clawbacks work in the case of an executive who got a $50 million bonus, and you might be able to, that's gonna really hurt, but trying to figure out how to get $750,000 worth of credit in a multi-million-dollar resolution where it might cost you at least that much to claw the dollars back, the incentives are just misaligned there in ways that the way it sounds like the department is leaning now, it makes a lot more economic sense too.
Great, so I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, a couple. So feedback's always welcome. But kidding aside, I think everyone said, I agree. I think it's all reasonable and good feedback. I would note a couple of things. That was a concern, frankly, that I and others had. One that you mentioned, Dan, that we're going to have somehow elevate clawbacks as some super compliance criteria that's more important than any others. I hope we're not doing that. And again, this is a pilot program. If this ends up doing that, I think there'll probably be a correction. We're aware of that concern. We've shared it. It's certainly not the intention, which ties to the other thing that's worth noting. The clawbacks policy really has two components to it. And the clawbacks part, which gets the most attention we're talking about, is optional. So this is a clawback or credit given if money is withheld if a company elects to do so. If a company elects to do so, then the clawback policy kicks in. This is not mandated, it's not required, it is an incentive if a company, and Albemarle is a good recent example, there may be others, but it's not required. The first part of the policy is required, and I think that's a good thing for everybody. It does, every settlement now that the department, that my team and the department, the criminal division has with the corporation will include compliance promoting criteria. So now, and I will say when I was in-house, that was something, we had a very strong compliance program, I was very proud of it. That was something that we struggled with. How are we going to connect and link, or should we even? And there are great compliance folks in the community who don't actually think this is not a good idea. And that's a conversation that is happening and should continue. But the notion of somehow trying to link that high-powered CEO who doesn't care about, that isn't even thinking about going to jail, and is really just thinking about how many millions of dollars he or she may get this year and next, but somehow linking their compensation, their bonus, their stock equity, or their compensation in some way to compliance and ethics, that is hard for companies to do. And I will say that the first part of what we're calling the clawback policy has nothing to do with clawbacks. It's about incentivizing every company. You've come to us and you're selling with us, you've got a problem. We're settling with you, but now as part of it, we're requiring you to take a step in the direction of having compliance promoting criteria as part of your company's compliance program. I think that's an important step that shouldn't be lost either. But I think the feedback that's given is fair. As I think folks know, we took a lot of input. We spoke to people in the academia, the corporate community, the white collar community, compliance community. We got a lot of feedback. It is a pilot program. There may be changes or that we may make going forward, but we'll figure it out together.
I just wanted to speak up on behalf of the clawback program. One, this part you just mentioned, Glenn, which is the including compliance promoting criteria into compensation. Many companies sort of talk at our events sort of going, well, I wouldn't know how to do that the more they see it done. That's going to be a helpful educative moment. On the clawbacks, I don't see the main value as being aimed at the wrongdoers. Where I'm hoping it could move the needle is, as I read it, and perhaps I misread it, it includes supervisors. It doesn't.
It includes supervisors to the extent that they participated in or were willfully blind to.
I care about the willfully blind.
But that's a private, right? Those are criminals.
Okay.
But my point is,
No,
I know
my
where you're
point is
going, and I
that
agree with you.
There are a lot of supervisors, and you see this in a number of the crimes who know full well it's happening, but people don't want to raise their head above the water and speak out. It puts genuine skin in the game because we don't always go after. In fact, we don't necessarily usually go after supervisors who did no more than know it was happening and not stop it. They just, if they look at the data, they're not going to jail. So it's really good to give them some skin in the game. I do think it would be nice to then say, and by the way, if you self-report, you're out of the clawback policy. The company can't claw you back. Because I'm looking to do anything to get supervisors to come in the door.
And I agree with you, by the way, Jennifer. I think that that is a category of individuals that has not really been addressed through this. But I agree with you that is an area where there could be more focus.
Thank you so much. So I think it's time to close, but so from audience, so we try to take some 1 or 2 questions. So if you have, do you have any questions? Please.
Glenn, I'd like to ask, as you're searching for the publicly available data that's out there, what kind of sources are you accessing to be able to have another way of finding internal corporate issues?
Sure. So, as I touched on earlier, in the healthcare context, it's a bit easier because it's Medicaid, it's Medicare data, and that is publicly available. So that's publicly available, and that is a source of just finding flags and finding fraud. So to underscore, it's the data we're going to look at is always going to be publicly available. We're not it's publicly. I mean, just to use one example, SARS data. That is information that suspicious activity reports. That is something that all banks have to file. There's a lot of data there, but if there's a way, or a lot of SARS reports out there, but if there's a way to figure out how to read them more quickly, more thoughtfully, to find flags, that may be, again, just to use one example in a limited amount of time, that's just one example, but again, it's to take publicly available information and thinking of more thoughtful ways to look at that kind of data.
One question on the private equity and M&A transactions. Why wouldn't the A teams include compliance professionals, and why couldn't private equities actually do more before closing? So between signing and closing, sometimes there's like a year or a year and a half there where you can actually do diligence, remediation, hire compliance professionals. Like, is that
Do you want the honest answer to that question, or do you want the practical realities?
The practical, because I'm interested, because I've worked with some private equities that actually do that, but some are struggling from what you're talking about.
And look, it's a matter of resource allocation, right? I mean, one, it costs money to stand up a significant compliance regime in a company that you're planning on selling in 3 years. That's not to say you won't do anything in the compliance space, but and if you're starting from nothing, then obviously you're going to have to invest some resources. And I think during the diligence process, private equity would see that. But there's also like incentives to get these deals done, right? Getting to close, is paramount in a lot of these deals. And so finding problems that impede getting to close when the prevailing view is we'll deal with those issues in the reps and warranties in the deal and we'll solve them on the back end is kind of how these things work. And convincing people who are very bottom line oriented to invest on the front end or even the middle end post acquisition in significant compliance resources without a really good reason and without an understanding, an explanation why adding those resources are going to add value on the back end when you get to sale it's a difficult conversation and a difficult thing to convince people of the merits of.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so actually, I really appreciate the discussion you have. So it's very, very informative. And so I hope that this session is very, very informative for our audience. Thank you very much.